was the main organizer for an open house for the 100th anniversary of the opening of the Bay Street Armory. For that open house, we invited there was about 30 different community groups um, with displays. And for the Old Cemetery Society, I put together a series of panels. Now, as you can see there, I've done a lot of commemoration work, especially and a lot of First World War history work, as well as Second World War. First World War, we're all used to seeing the pictures of the veterans, the cemeteries, especially in France and Belgium, and that have the crosses rows on rows of the markers. And most of those markers are in cemeteries run by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, especially those related to the First and Second World War. Now, important thing to know is that they only take care of people who are considered to be war dead. And to be war dead means you had to, in case of the First World War, have died between the 4th of August, the beginning of the war, and the 31st of August, 1921, to be considered war dead. So they recognized that after the end of the war, there's a certain period of time that people would die of wounds. So, and in the Second World War, they set the dates from the beginning of the war, the 3rd of September, 1939, to the 31st of December, 1947. So, in the First and Second World Wars, there was about 1,600,000 Canadians participated, either at home or in Europe. Now, war dead inside those categories for Canadians in those two wars was only 114,000. The number of war dead buried in Canada is 18,000. So you had a 1.5 million served. So where are the rest? They're veterans who are buried in cemeteries across Canada. Some of them with, most of them didn't have military markers. They were just family markers. And so in 1914, decided to try and identify quite a few markers that were in various cemeteries in the Greater Victoria area. And so that's where I identified a lot of the small cemeteries. So when the opportunity came to give this tour, I was able to go to those and then expand on it. And we're going to see, we're going to visit, there's 4 tours, Western communities. Let me just go to the next slide. I put that in case there was anybody from far away who's not familiar with where we're talking about. But we have 4 tours. So the Western communities, Saanich Peninsula, the Gulf Islands, and the the Cowichan Valley, north of the Malahat, Mill Bay, um, uh, Shawnigan Lake, and the Cowichan Valley. So what's not included in the tours are the 4 core municipality cemeteries, because most of those have had tours in them before, either regularly or frequently by the Old Cemetery Society. Small families, a couple of small family cemeteries. In the Western communities, we'll see a marker on the map for Hatley Memorial Park, but it's a big one that tours have been done there before. And I have not included First Nations cemeteries. So let's start the tour by going out to the Western communities. So on the tour, you notice that the little marker here, that's referring to the large cemetery, Hatley Memorial Park. There'll be 2, 4, and 5 are sites that you're not able to visit without special permission. 4 is on Department of National Defense grounds, and 5 is at the William Head Institution. So most of these cemeteries are pioneer cemeteries. And so as we go through each one, there's quite a lot of them. There'll be a lot of the dates they began, the date the church was established, and the cemetery beside it in most cases. They'll talk about early pioneer families. So a lot of the stories are very similar for a lot of these cemeteries. So what I'll try and focus on today is just doing the tour, bringing you to the spots, encouraging you to visit these places um, on your own if you get the opportunity for outings into these areas. And another thing I'd like to encourage too to people to think about as you're going on is especially with young people in your life, whether they're nieces, nephews, grandchildren, etc., especially those that are really curious in the sort of 8 to 11-year-old range, is if you visit the cemetery, identify a name or an interesting marker. And if it's a name, do a little research on it. And if it's a military grave, there's a lot, especially First World War, you can find records. Just have the young person participate in that. Or we'll see a couple of interesting markers here where young people could make up some really interesting stories. So let's start the Colwood Pioneer Cemetery. It sits here now. Right beside it is Hatley Park, the really large one. But there's two pioneer cemeteries side by side, and the first one is Colwood. It The land in that area was owned by the Pratt family, who donated some land to at the time was St. Matthew's Presbyterian Church. So the this one dates back to the cemetery committee meeting in about 1925. And quote, to measure the cemetery and divide off into lots to be sold at $5 per lot plot. Pretty reasonable. So the old Presbyterian church that was there was removed from the site a few years later, and the Colwood Women's Institute kept the records and maintained the cemetery for a long time after that. Then the city of Colwood took it over, the maintenance and control in 1993. And so a lot of Colwood's founding families are buried there, and they describe it as a peaceful place shaded by oak trees where wildflowers grow among the graves. So these are all really nice contemplative places to visit. Now, right next door to that is St. John the Baptist. Um, it In 1910, a quarter of an acre was donated by a pioneer Anglican family, and it included the Dunsmuirs and the Peat family. The Peat family also donated the land to the Colwood Pioneer Cemetery, so they were seemed to hedge their bets. The church, again, in 1993, Colwood took over the responsibility for the churchyard, and the church is designated a heritage property in Colwood. Now, the next stop is in Machosen, and we're not going to spend too much time here because there's an Old Cemetery Society tour of this site in September, the 21st of September. And so you'll be able to get a lot of information on that. This is a really striking little cemetery as well. 2 acres for the church and graveyard were gifted by a local family. The building fund was headed by Sir James Douglas. So this is a really old cemetery. 1876, the churchyard was fenced in and the ground was consecrated. Um, in 1883, as a quote, as a token of their esteem for his liberality, a marble tablet was erected saying a few of the settlers in memory of John Whitty, who died the day before the consecration of the church. So it's particularly beautiful in the springtime when the grounds are covered with white lilies. Now, Albert Head, which is I've done tours or presentations and before on military in the area, and it was at various times, especially in the Second World War, all the headlands were taken over by Department of National Defense. Um, and so Albert Head Lagoon was one of those properties. Now it started its life as a quarantine station that was built there in 1883. Now, quarantine was used, of course, especially the CP steamship line would be bringing people from Asia, and after the railway was built, most of the stops for the steamships was Vancouver, where they could hook up with CP rail. Now, if in the case in December 1891 and again in April 1892, two ships came into Vancouver that had some confirmed cases of smallpox. So they sent those ships back to the quarantine station that was here at Albert Head. Now, the it was a very inadequate site, and it was closed in 1893 when they opened the new quarantine station at William Head, where we'll go next. Now, as you can see from the image there, there's only three known graves at the site, but there were rumors that as many as 40 people were buried in a slit trench on the property, but there's no confirmation of this, and I don't know how anybody would be able to prove or disprove that. There's so just three memorials and perhaps 40 burials. Now, on each of these slides, I've shown the number of memorials that are shown on the Find a Grave website. So the number of memorials will be less than the number of burials in this cemetery. But that was an easy number to find. So William Head, and again, I just want to advertise a special event that's going to take place on Saturday, the 5th of April at 2 p.m. And it's a Chinese Labor Corps Qing Ming Festival. Space is limited to 50 people for the tour because that's all that the institution will allow on the for the day. So reservations are required, and there's information available on the Old Cemetery Society website to register for that. Now, it was opened in 1893. It covers 106 acres. At its prime, it had 42 buildings. 13 families were housed there on the grounds as staff. They had their own school come chapel. And often they had to travel to Victoria. They did it by a small steamer called the Madge. Now, I don't know much about that, but that might be an interesting story for somebody to do some work on. As a quote says, there are 49 souls at William Head Institution that are all sentenced to be there for eternity. Well, every time I hear the word institution, so correctional institution, not a prison, I always think of my grade 4 teacher who used to correct my spelling. So I don't know what they're correcting at an institution these days, but it's not a prison. So now, the main thing, there were only about 20 burials that there before the time of the First World War. And the main thing that happened at that camp was the many thousands, about 85,000 Chinese men were contracted from the British government to go to Europe to do labor on the Western Front in Belgium and France. They at first they didn't they did all these arrangements. The British government they went to the provinces in China, hired all the people, made all the arrangements, and then they informed the Canadian government that their Canadian Pacific steamships would be bringing these people, and they'd have to go across Canada with the Canadian government's help. So they all stopped at William Head and trained. So the image here shows one of the contingents. You can see that's a large number of people, and you can see the tent encampment in behind them. So while they were there were 26 Chinese men who died. Now, because they were there and in the service of the British government at the time of the First World War, they were all entitled to Commonwealth war graves, and those have been installed at the site. So there was two soldiers that were part of the Canadian Forces who were buried there, and there's one other civilian. So that was they were the ones that are known and have Commonwealth war grave markers. So the last burial at that cemetery was a fellow by the name of George Lorimer, and he died at sea in 1939 at the age of 48. Now, it's a really interesting story that just coming up with this for this tour, that looking into the quarantine stations, of course, so there was Albert Head and then now this one at William Head. But a lot of people who are new to Victoria won't know that there was an immigration hospital in James Bay on Dallas Road between November 1909 and 1958. When we came here in 1990, the site was just a vacant lot. It was across from the Coast Guard station, and there's a townhouse complex on it now. But there's another interesting story for the future. On the road going into Souk, there's um, there's a cemetery called Souk Harbor Cemetery. Now it's sometimes referred to as Casinos because it's that's the area was called that. And right across the street, you can see on the marker, there's a George family cemetery. It's quite small. I just indicated here, I'm not covering it on this tour. So the Souk Harbor Cemetery was opened in 1922 by the Souk Harbor Cemetery Company. And in 1989, the Souk Lions Club took it over, the care and maintenance, and still manage it today. It has approximately 500 graves and is still active. But the information on the Find a Grave site says there's 623 memorials. So these are the things you find when you're doing research in this, slightly different numbers than so. But the list of gravestones is there on Find a Grave for that cemetery. The Now an ex Old Cemetery Society board member, Fern Perkins, has two grandfathers who were veterans of the First World War who were buried there, and they didn't know each other. They're from two sides of the family, James Marrison and Joseph Barker. And so they were featured on one of the panels that we did for that anniversary of the Bay Street Armory. But there's a great story here related to her grandfather, Joseph Barker. And it goes, Grandfather Barker wrote poetry while in the trenches in France. Back home during the dirty 30s, the crank of his big old truck, the Giant, broke his wrist. He fretted about how he was going to earn money to feed his family of 9 while he wasn't able to drive. So he pulled out his old notebook of war poems and turned it into a book. Joe sold copies of his Rambling Rhymes door to door and was able to make enough money to make ends meet until he was able to go back to driving his truck. Great story like that. Next stop, the Knox Presbyterian Church in Souk. The original church was opened in 1898. There are no known cemetery records. However, they know that a lot of early pioneers of Souk are buried there. The But there's one inscription I found that you can see here to Snape. And again, interesting First World War related story. So it says the funeral of the late Philip Bertram Snape, who passed away at the Esquimalt Military Hospital on Saturday night, will be held this afternoon in Victoria, and then or probably Esquimalt, and then proceed to Souk, where internment will take place. A military fighting squad. He went overseas for the opening of hostilities of the First World War, and he was severely wounded in the Battle of Cambrai while showing remarkable bravery. He was rendered a hopeless invalid as a result of those wounds and sent back to Canada, where he was a patient at the Esquimalt Military Hospital. That was reported in the Daily Colonist in June 1920. So he didn't die 1920. So he then his wife, she lived until the age of 94 on Michigan Street in Victoria. But when she died, she was buried beside her husband out in Souk. There's one more cemetery in Souk that's goes now, the Muirside Family Cemetery. Anne Miller Muir was the matriarch of the family, and she passed away in 1875. And then eventually, I think there's 50 plus graves were counted in that small parcel of land. And I think the last family member buried there was in 1969. And it had gone into serious disarray and had suffered from a lot of vandalism. And there was a project that was taken on by the Souk Lions Club and the Souk Community Association, and it says in the write-up, other service organizations. The Old Cemetery Society assisted in this as well, and they cleaned up the cemetery, put a gate in, and put an interpretive panel that talks about a lot of the members of the family. So again, projects far and wide that the Old Cemetery Society has been involved in. So we're going to go on a little tour now out the Saanich Peninsula. Um, so I say we're not covering the core municipalities, the major cemeteries, but you can see the distribution here. Most of them are out in Central and North Saanich, but there is one in Saanich, and that's St. Michael's and All Angels. Um, so a lot of the they on their website they say how, and this is really important, I think, generally, the cemetery makes a valuable contribution to the history of Saanich by providing a tangible reminder in the memorial inscriptions of the pioneers who are buried there. And that's true of a lot of the pioneer cemeteries. Again, the land was donated by a parishioner, this case, John Stevens. He was a proprietor of a place called the Halfway House. I don't know anything about the Halfway House, but that would be interesting to find out what it was halfway towards. The ground was clear, the lumber was cut, and shingles for the roofs made, all by local material. And they had donations and grants from as far away as England. And it was designed by a local architect designer, Henry Mitchell, who was active in Victoria until 1860s to 1880s. Out in central Saanich is this wee tiny cemetery on East Saanich Road called Shady Creek Cemetery. It's beside the church called Shady Creek United. The cemetery predates the church. So it was not a church cemetery. It's a separate cemetery from the church. The land for both was donated by the same person, a fellow by the name of Robert John, who had a 250-acre farm running along East Saanich Road. And it's believed that the first burial was one of his young children. So it was the Shady Creek Methodist Church that was built on the adjoining land. It's the smallest operating cemetery in the greater Victoria area, so that indicates that it's still open for burials. So the earliest burial records in the cemetery have been lost, and there are no photographs from the first decades. So it's difficult to know exactly who's buried there. But there are numerous wooden headboards, some of them still standing. Of course, wooden headboards deteriorate over time. In 1981, the Victoria Genealogical Society conducted an inventory of the gravestones and found 116 families. And the Sluggett family was the largest contingent. And so that's a well-known family out in the rural Saanich area. And one of the largest family plots in Shady Creek is that of the Alexander family, which is one of the well-known early um, black families that came to Victoria and farmed in that area. Now, Robert John, who donated the land and who's one of his children was buried there, he moved away from Shady Creek, but he died in 1905. And he was the warden of the provincial jail, which was on Hillside Avenue where S.J. Willis School is now. And that's something I didn't know before. And so they had a special train arranged to carry his body from Victoria out to Shady Creek Cemetery where he was buried. Now, a really beautiful site, cemetery that's a little hard to find. It's off Mount Newton Crossroad, St. Stephen's Anglican Church. Now, I think it was back in the 90s, the Old Cemetery Society had a major project there and did a lot of work and a lot of documentation. And so I can't remember all the details. But did I miss one? Oh, Our Lady of the Assumption. Oh, yes, I did. Okay, let's go back. Our Lady of the Assumption. Now that's on a spectacular site on the I guess that's the West Saanich Road. But when you're standing there looking, you can just see across the Saanich Inlet over to the Malahat. And it's a really beautiful site. Now it's now part of a parish, a Roman Catholic parish that combines this church and St. Elizabeth of Hungary Church in Sydney. Now, Catholic priests were some of the early missionaries that started working with First Nations people way back in the 1850s. And the original log church building on this site was put in 1860. So the cemetery that's associated with it serves the two communities, Roman Catholic pioneers, and also the people from the Sartlip First Nations and from the area. There's a lot of information about the parish and the churches, but I wasn't able to find out very much information about the cemetery and the burials there. So we'll move on. Now we're at St. Stephen's, where again the Old Cemetery Society had that major project in the 90s. Did a lot of documentation. The first service in the St. Stephen's Church was in 1862, and the first funeral took place in 1869 at the adjoining cemetery. This is a truly beautiful site that's well worth a visit. The Now, the folklore says apparently that there are other burials in front of the church that were put there between 1862 and 1883, but I can't confirm any of that. The It was 1883. The lands were deeded to Bishop Hill, who was the bishop at the Anglican Cathedral in Victoria. He's the one that had that was on the outs with that created the Church of Our Lord down the hill from the cathedral. Now, um, what was I going to? I had something I was going to add in that folklore around burials. I know that in Britain, especially, there are a lot of burials on properties adjacent to the walls of cemeteries. And that was people who weren't able to be buried in the cemetery for whatever reason, committing a crime, etc. And the family members would bury them as close as possible to consecrated ground as they could get, even if they were refused to be in the consecrated ground. And that often created problems for developers who are building a building and coming across remains just outside the gates of the fences of the adjoining property. So I don't know if there's something related to that that might have meant that people were putting some burials outside the church. Who knows? Mysteries. Holy Trinity. Again, this is another really beautiful setting. Um, right on the corner of the road that's just north of the airport at Pat Bay. And the views from there, again, are really beautiful. And this is a really beautiful site. There have been Old Cemetery Society tours here. The first burial was in February 1888. And so the churchyard was opened just before that. In 1891, just 3 years later, they expanded the churchyard. So, um, and now the present site is the size is over 2 acres with 1,700 plots. So here, 1,600 memorials, as it said, 1,700 plots. I don't know if it's full or not, but again, it's a pioneer cemetery for with lots of families related to North Cowichan. Many plots have no marker stones indicating the names and dates. Again, some of them might have been wooden and then deteriorated, but there are handwritten receipts, maps, lists, and other records that were made by sextons and wardens of the church over the years. So they have very good records. I want to talk to somebody who's buried there who is really quite famous in some ways, but a lot of people don't know about George Randolph Perks, 1888 to 1984. His wife Constance is also buried there. She was born in 1902 and died in 1995. The He served in the First World War and was awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the highest honor for bravery in the British Commonwealth forces. He was born in Waterford, England. He immigrated to Canada in 1906, and he served as a major in the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles. So often you'll see in relation to Victoria, say, May Willows Camp, the CMR, that's Canadian Mounted Rifles, which became part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And it was in January 1918 that he was awarded the Victoria Cross for gallantry at Passchendaele in Belgium. And that was in 30th of October 1917. He received the medal in 1918. He rose to be a Major General in the Canadian Army. He was the Minister of Defense for Canada between 1957 and 1960. He was Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia from 1960 to 1968. And his wife, Constance, was born in Cochrane, Alberta, and she lived on until she was 93 years old. Um, was in Vancouver, but she's buried here with her husband. Um, so he's got him, even though he died outside the dates of being a Commonwealth War grave person, he's got this memorial because of the Victoria Cross that he was awarded. Now, it's not a cemetery, but I just wanted to put this in along the top of the airport. This site is called Hospital Hill. It's a high rise, a bit of a rise in the land, close to the um, the cemetery, but the Holy Trinity. But it's got a wonderful view of the airport. But this memorial was put in called Lost Airmen of the Empire Memorial. The airport at Pat Bay, before it became Victoria International, was part of the Commonwealth Air Training Program that was had trained pilots for the Second World War across Canada. A lot of people died in training. 177 Allied airmen and three others gave their lives at Pat Bay Highway in accidents. Some of those accidents happened in all the larger area of the southern island that they were flying over. There was crashes and all kinds of things. So anyway, this memorial was created in 1916 by a local sculptor, Hilarion Gallant, and it was dedicated in June 1st, 2017. It cost $160,000, but it's magnificent. If you haven't been there, you go. So there was uh, water jet was used to cut into 25 of these 8 foot high corten steel Cooper's Hawk's feathers. So you can see how they've cut into them. So these go right through, and it's a magnificent sight. So we'll leave the Saanich Peninsula with that one, and we'll make our way over to the Gulf Islands. So, Salt Spring Island. I didn't include that in the original group that I did for that set of panels, but you see there's 7 cemeteries there. Um, the first being St. Paul's Roman Catholic Cemetery. It was founded in 1878 as the first Roman Catholic missionary mission on the Gulf Islands. The church was erected between 1880 and 1885. Now, some of the windows and door and bell were acquired from the Butter Church in Cowichan Station. Now, that's near in Cowichan Bay. Now, that's an interesting story. It's a little church that sits on a hilltop near a First Nations cemetery. And there's a whole story around that that we're not going to go into today because there's no cemetery there. Um, it was the church was formally dedicated in 1885. Um, so don't have a lot of information on the burials that are here. So we're going to move on. St. Mary's Cemetery, very close by to the previous one. Now, what the Anglican Church has done is they've combined, they're calling it now the Ireland Parish of Salt Spring Island, that includes several churches. Um, so again, graves of many Salt Spring Island pioneers. Um, in 1889, the land again was given by John Sparrow after his son, a 19-year-old boy or young man, was accidentally shot by pit lampers. Now, pit lamper, so that's going back even to the 1889s. Pit lamping is still used by some people in hunting, and that's when you hunt at night with the blinding the animals with the headlights of your vehicle or a large um, spotlight. You stun them, they stop, you shoot them. Not something that legitimate hunters agree with or like, um, but it happens, and that's how the son of John Sparrow was killed. The It was the land here was consecrated in the June 1894, um, and some of the pews were taken from that came over here were taken from the second cathedral at Church Hill in Victoria. That's where the courthouse is now. So the first cathedral on that site, the first church burnt down. They built a large wooden cathedral, and it stayed until they built the cathedral behind it where it exists now. So when they tore down the second cathedral, the wooden one, I guess they distributed some of the windows and pews to different places, and that'd be an interesting story to follow up on, but not today. And some of the windows came from St. John the Divine site, which had a church called the Iron Church, which preceded the one that was there. One of the burials here on this site is a fellow named John Brandford. And again, he was part of the 2 CMR, Canadian Mounted Rifles, which we saw reference to before. He enlisted in Victoria. He was a rancher. A lot of the people on the islands here were listed as ranchers. He was born in Suffolk, England. He was a trooper. That means he was a private in the cavalry, and he ended up becoming a corporal. But he was mentioned in dispatches by Sir Douglas Haig, who was the supreme commander of the British Commonwealth forces in the First World War. Now, he was discharged in 1919. And the interesting thing here that I found that while he was in service, he was a trooper. He he was designated as pay to be sent to Frank Hill. Musgrave, BC is a point on the west side of Salt Spring Island, facing over towards Cowichan Bay. Um, they're buried side by side. He sent us pay. Now, this is just a little clip from the Salt Spring archives have online burial records for all the cemeteries on the island. And they have the name, the deceased date. Um, and in these 2 points, they have a close-up. If you just click on those when you go to their website, this is a there's a close-up view of the marker, and then there's a further back view showing the entire plot. And they've got that for all the cemeteries. So they've done a tremendous job over the years. So the annual monthly pay was $25. And it went to what they called the mountain branch of one bank. It was in Fulford Harbor. Now, he died in 1934. So again, he was a veteran, but he wasn't war dead because he was outside the dates of the Commonwealth War grave. But they were obviously close friends. And now, St. Mary's Parish Church. So, right? Yeah. This is this same church. Of course, the churches are dealing with diminishing congregations, buildings that they don't know what to do with, that they're having to either put up for sale. The say the Anglican Church on Salt Spring Island created the parish um, uh, of Salt Spring Island. But this is one example of enriching a building use. And so what they've done, it's an interesting website. They started the program called Star of the Sea, a Center for Spiritual Living and Practice. So they've got programming that um, includes um, a lot of spiritual search programs. Various religions are involved. It is Christian based, but they look at a lot of other religions. Now, right now, apparently, it's temporarily suspended because of church maintenance buildings, but it is an example of how um, a creative way of trying to expand the use of the some of the buildings and the kind of the ways and programs that more people will participate in. So just up the road is Burgoyne United Church. Very nice drawing here. It was built in 1887. Now they say this is the oldest Protestant church in Salt Spring Island. Again, Pioneer Cemetery. Um, and regular services. Yeah, 1861 was the first church there. It was a preaching point for Methodist circuit missionaries from Vancouver Island. Um, the present church was built and dedicated in 1952 with additional renovations. So small church, small graveyard, but well worth a visit when you're on the circuit, the Salt Spring Island circuit. Something that's quite new is a natural cemetery. Again, there's the Burgoyne United Church, and just close by. That's from the information I could find. There are only about 3 or 4 burials at the site so far, so it is very new. It's a licensed cemetery and forest memorial, offering a place for remembering, contemplating, and celebrating life and death. Um, they very interesting and well done website that explains the services they provide. Um, And a very nice statement they have on their website, which sort of applies to all cemeteries. Memorializing our people reminds us that we are part of something greater than just ourselves, that we are part of this universe through past, present, and future. Very nice statement. There is a cemetery, it's got 147 memorials Purdy Cunningham Memorial Cemetery. That's part, again, the Irish parish of the island parish of Salt Spring Island. That's the Anglican parish. Um, it's memorialized. It's one of the four cemeteries that are owned and managed by this parish. I don't have any information um, there's no very little information on the parish website about the cemetery. And an interesting thing too was I found that in a lot of the Anglican church websites where there's a cemetery attached, you have to log in to get information. So that makes it a little tough. You'd think they'd want to have it more open and accessible, but don't know the reason for that. The Ganges Community Cemetery. Um, the burial database is online, but there's little information published on the cemetery's history, so I wasn't able to glean very much there. But it looks like there's some really interesting markers there that would make it worth a stroll through if you're on a wee tour of Salt Spring Island. St. Mark's Cemetery. Um, it was established in 1892 and deconsecrated in 2022. Um, it's again one of those four cemeteries that the Anglican parish of Salt Spring Island owns and manages. One grave reference I saw there was Canadian War Grave Memorial. This one to a Corporal Ernest Stanford. He served in the Royal Engineers in the UK, so obviously he came to Canada after the war. But he's got a Commonwealth War Grave marker because he died on the 19th of August, 1921, at the age of 36. The cutoff date was the 31st of August for a Commonwealth War Grave, so he just made it by 12 days. So 13 days. If he died 13 days later, he wouldn't have had a Commonwealth War Grave marker. He'd just have a personal marker. There's a couple of other cemeteries on the Gulf Islands. There's one on Galliano, the main island, and on Pender. In the Galliano Cemetery, which is looked after by the Church of St. Margaret of Scotland, it, this picture here really shows the site that's right on the edge of the cliff. So if you're coming on the ferry and you're heading towards Sawasan, you would be going by this way. And the steepness here is same as the steepness on the other side. So the land of this cemetery was gifted to them in 1928 and then expanded in 2016. It's the expanded part is actually a Ralph and Clara Stevens Memorial Edition, it's called, but it's yet to be developed. So I guess they're dealing with they've got the land, but how many people are being buried these days as opposed to cremated and ashes strewn? Um, the whole question of the benefits of cemeteries is remembering places. Now they've had a lot of erosion along the cliffside here, and they had a lot of damage from a major windstorm in 2019. A lot of trees fell over, damaged markers. And so they've been dealing with that since. They did a plan of all the repairs that were required, and they've been working away at it, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. In February 1923, they just uh, renovated the Lich Gate here, and they do have some uh, markers from Japanese families that were buried there. And we cross over to Main Island um, in Miners Bay, this is called, because apparently the miners, before the ship started going over the Fraser River Gold Rush, some of them would start rowing, and this is as far as they would get on the first day. But there's little information on the church and the cemetery that I could find. But there's an interesting fellow note there, OCN Giovanni Axel Bergstrom Bjornsfeld, his veteran. Now, that's an interesting combination with Giovanni and Axel and Bergstrom. He was born on 2nd of January 1889 in Sweden, and he died on Curlew Island at the age of 42. Now, it says on some church records that he was buried in St. Mary Magdalene churchyard. Now, I put question mark beside that in my notes because I looked up his military records. He was before the First World War. He was a reservist with the 88th Fusiliers, and that was the first infantry reserve regiment that was created in Victoria in 1912, and it was followed in 1913 by the 50th Gordon Highlanders. Now he went overseas with the 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish, which included um, members from the Gordon Highlanders in Victoria, plus three other Highland regiments across the country. In 1916, he received shrapnel wounds in his knee and foot while in the trenches near Ypres. That's exploding artillery shells full of shrapnel. He was admitted to the Canadian General Hospital Number 1 in Etaples, France, on the coast of the English Channel. Then he was transferred to military hospitals in England, first to Norfolk, where I think he had most of the surgery done, and then to Shorncliffe, where he stayed for recuperation. He was there in these two hospitals for 7 months, but his injuries were so bad that he was then sent back to Canada in January 1917. The quote in his service record says his condition prevented the soldier from earning full livelihood. He's unable to use one leg at all. And then an interesting thing that you don't see often in the service records, there was an entry about him because he died within um, about whether he should get a some kind of memorial. But it says an entry, no action pending, report as to the relationship of death to service. Okay, this was for um, probably for pension. So he died, he drowned. So what was the relationship of his drowning to the service and the injuries he received? That was a question mark in a service record. Now, it says there that he drowned and body never recovered. So there, again, different records. Was he actually buried in the cemetery as the cemetery records show, or was he it's just commemorated? Because there is a plaque and a pew in one of the churches which says in memory of Ossian Bjornsfeld, military medal. He was decorated. Curlew Island, 1931. Now, Curlew Island is one of the little islands that's just to the south of um, of Main Island. Um, um, yeah, that's just quite very small. So it's just forest now. So don't know what happened. That he was in a boat, drowned? Did he suffering from his wounds that were so serious that maybe he walked into the water? Don't know. The cemetery on Pender Island was established in 1905. It has 1 acre of land that was donated to it. There's very little information online, but there is an interesting story related to Ochterlony, Captain J.H., and his wife Olive. Now, it looks like he had the nickname Curly, and you'll see why when I go to the next slide. There's Curly and his wife and 4 children. There's one other source of information said he had 5. So I don't know, there's the 4. He was born in 1867 in St. Andrews, Scotland. Jenny, don't have information on her birth and death date, but they were married on the 23rd of May, 1899, and in Victoria. So here's the the wedding announcement. A couple of really interesting words here. So I'll read it. A few friends and relatives of the contracting parties. There's an interesting term, eh? Gathered on Tuesday evening at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Higginbottom at number 9 Amelia Street, Victoria, and witnessed the ceremony, quote, linking the fortunes of James Ochterlony, a well-to-do rancher of Pender Island, and Miss Jane Jenny Thatcher of New Westminster. So they both came from money, and they were linking their fortunes um, as contracting partners. Interesting. Reverend J.D.P. Knox of the Victoria West Methodist Church performed the ceremony, after which all sat down to a dainty supper. Well, I think if I was going to the wedding of two people who were contracting to bring their fortunes together, I'd want a little more than a dainty supper. Anyway, the happy couple will make their home on Pender Island. So the death notice says that he passed away very suddenly early this week from the effects of pneumonia. He is survived by a widow and four children, the eldest of whom is only 12 years old, and he leaves many friends to mourn. So that was in 1912. Nice picture, though, isn't it? Again, another case where the person was a rancher. So let's move on now to north of the Malahat. Um, there's 10 cemeteries here. Yeah. And so I'm going to leave five to the end because it's the most interesting, but we'll go through here quickly. The Before we do that, though, I want to give a special tribute to Mike Byling here and his partner, Sherry Depchuk, for the work that they did in relation to Lest We Forget Cowichan Valley Veterans Burials Project. So we both use Lest We Forget in terms of my identifying memorials where veterans were buried. And Mike used it up in the Cowichan Valley. And what he's done, he's identified where veterans are buried. And then every November during Remembrance Week, they have cadets and members of the Legion come out and they put white crosses on all the stones. There's a similar project here called that puts stones on military markers in some of the cemeteries around Victoria using school children. But Mike's done a terrific job up there. So the first cemetery, Shawnigan Lake, it um, it was established around 1950, um, and they had a cemetery board. Um, since 1999, it's been maintained year-round um, by the Malahat Lions Club with support from South Cowichan Rotary Club. It's a memorial garden. One of the people buried there who was quite remarkable was E.J. Hughes. Now, E.J. Hughes was a painter, and he's done a lot of books um, on boats and Vancouver Island and British Columbia um, that are really remarkable. But there was a book written by Robert Amos recently about his Canadian war art. He was one of the original Canadian war artists in the Second World War, so I assisted in that a little bit. The So I'll just talk about Hughes a little bit as we go through. He painted for over 70 years. Um, and one of the quotes he has, I have painted in the Cowichan Valley for 50 years, and it is the most beautiful place on earth. So somebody well worth looking up. Yes. Mill Bay United Church, the original church built in 1898. Um, It's now owned by the Cowichan Valley Regional District since 2007. I'm going to quickly go through because of time now for some of these. Um, so not a lot. of information. Again, this is one of the ceremonies they did around, lest we forget where they lie. There's that Mike Depchuk. Next one, St. Francis Xavier, Roman Catholic Church. Again, from 1887. One of the parishioners there noticed that he said, most of the people who built the church are still there, only they're in the cemetery. So, next one, St. John the Baptist Anglican. That's a beautiful little church. That's in Cobble Hill. Um, Again, don't have a lot of information on the burials there, but an interesting thing, the Vancouver Island Masonic History Project, and I'm not sure the years that they did that, but they did um, identified all Masons from the Cowichan Valley who were buried in churches in the area and have a database of those. A beautiful little church. Now, this one, the story of St. Peter's Commission is published in a booklet. This is a really superbly beautiful little cemetery, um, and belongs to the Anglican Church. It's I'm not going to say a lot about it because there's a lot of material available. It's worth visiting. Um, there's information on a lot of the people who were buried there, settler community, um, veterans. There has been a tour. They do tours themselves that occasionally, so they're probably available on their website. Um, I have a story about Ernest Alfred Price and his wife, but for the like he was a pioneer that came from Britain, worked on the Okanagan Shuswap Railway to Vernon. He bought property at Somanus, which is an area of the Cowichan Valley. He farmed there. Then he opened hotels. So he had a hotel, the Quamachin Hotel on Duncan Street in Duncan. Then he had another one that was on Canada Avenue um, in Duncan that's now demolished. So lots of stories we can get to there. I'm going to hurry through a couple of others just to let you know they're there before I stop at my favorite at the end. St. Mary's Cemetery, Semanis. Semanis, again, is a little area in the Cowichan Valley. There's a small cemetery on Herd Road that's owned by that's run by the regional district, and but it's interesting because it's only burials there are people who were pioneers before 1890 and descendants. Interesting story. Mountain View Cemetery, we're not touching it. It's huge. Got 5,000 burials there. Um, so we're not stopping. This is very interesting, though, and I didn't know about this. The Old Hillcrest Chinese Cemetery, um, and it was built. There's 127 Chinese Canadians who are buried there, and it was built on land that was donated by the lumber company that they worked for, and so there's a lot of information on the cemetery and the people who are buried there. There's good records. Um, at least 124 graves. Um, and again, not very well known, but room for more work to be done there. Now, the furthest north we're going is All Saints Anglican at Westholme. Westholme is near the top, near the Crofton Road, sort of the top of the Cowichan Valley. And again, most of the graves identified there were part of the Vancouver Island Masonic History Project, who again did a terrific job. Now, we're going to end my favorite site of all of them, and that's the St. Andrew's Church, which sits in the heart of Cowichan Station. There are at least 170 memorials. This drawing is a lovely little drawing. We'll see a picture a little later. There's a cemetery around the front of the church, And then along the side of the hill, a little lower, there's another part of the cemetery that has a lot of graves. It originally started the church in about 1905. The church is not it was deconsecrated and it's sold, but this is a place where there's a really interesting project, again, enriching building use. St. Andrews, the heart of Cowichan Station. So the people of Cowichan Station, which was a stop on the ENN Railroad just before you get to Duncan, have done a lot of work in the area. They created the hub, which was using the old schoolhouse, and now they're working with the diocese, and they have title of the property for restoring the church to its former glory, and hopefully that includes the cemetery, which has land down here as well. Now, the one of the things that when I was doing work on commemoration, and I mentioned that there's a lot of attention paid to the cemeteries that have the Commonwealth War grave markers and the people who were war dead. But the reason I put so much attention on those veterans who survived the war and came back was largely because of the what's said on this marker. Oswald Howe Lunham, captain in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, served in France in the Passchendaele, called to his rest after long suffering patiently borne in 1930, 12 years after the war. He long suffered for 12 years before he died. And um, and that is true of so many. We had the example of the fellow from Souk who was in the Esquimalt Military Hospital. So that's a really forgotten part of the cemetery of the history of the people who served. One thing I like about the cemetery, a lot of recently the Veterans Affairs Canada have put up a lot of markers for veterans who didn't have identified military graves, etc. So there's been about 100 of them put up in Ross Bay Cemetery. But in an old cemetery like this, I like to see some of these markers. Maybe they've fallen over or placed in the ground. They've got some stuff. As long as they're clear and they can be read, it sort of shows the condition. There's some sentimentality there that really strikes me about it wasn't crisp and clean. It was messy and dirty, and war is messy and dirty, and we shouldn't go into it unless we really have to, etc. Now, what's interesting about this cemetery is a couple of the memorials. Now, here's one. You can see a close up. So it's got a bird on a branch. Not sure what else is there, but it's to a Dr. A. Kingscott. Um, but here's one grouping that I think is really unique and one of the markers. So there's the grouping and there's the marker. Now, what is that? Here's a case where I think if you were going through a cemetery with a young person, say, I guess 8 to 14 sort of thing, let their imagination run, and what would they come up with here? I was just reading something interesting about pre-Celtic Scotland, and it made reference to in Britain, stone circles were often thought to be dread consequences. In Cornwall, the hurler stone circle was considered by some to be the frozen result of Sabbath-breaking and reckless group of young men who dared to play Celtic version of hockey on Sunday. So the men were turned into a stone circle. The nearby Merry Maidens maidens were petrified young women who failed to respect the Lord's day. So anyway, so what is this tomb? Is this somebody who was falsely accused of doing some wrong in the Sabbath and he's trying to dig his way out because he wants the truth to be known? Well, let your imagination run wild. Come up with a story. Visit these cemeteries. Send in your thoughts and experiences to the newsletter and pick a name, because there's a lot of really wonderful things to see on all the small cemeteries of the greater Victoria area. So thank you, everybody.